Am I muted? Two. All right, folks. We've got quite the conversation for you today. Um, we're going to go over this entire document right here. Nah, just we're going to try to condense this whole thing in about an hour, which is going to be quite the task. So I want to introduce my two guests. You probably know them. We have Kenji Sugahara, who's the president of the Drone Service Provider Alliance, and we have Vic Moss. You've met him before as well. He's the vice president of the DSPA, and these guys do a lot for the industry. And as it turns out, Vic was on the Aviation Ruling Committee that created this report right here, which
Kenji
is a
was.
250-page. Say again.
Kenji was.
Yeah, Kenji was. What
You
did I
said I
say?
was.
Oh no, Kenji was. I'm sorry. I was looking at Vic. I knew Kenji was.
You goof.
So Kenji was on the ARC that came up with this recommendation. So we're going to go and talk about what the ARC is, what this document really means. Is it final regulation? Is it actually just a recommendation? What should we expect coming out of this? And then we're going to go over some of the big recommendations. There's like, I don't know, maybe 100 of them there. And we're just going to handpick the ones that I think apply to our viewers that have the potential to make a change. So before I go any further, Kenji, Vic, welcome on board.
Thanks, Greg. Excited to be on. Thank you.
Awesome. So why don't we get started and we talk about what is the ARC?
So the ARC is an aviation rulemaking committee, and what it does is it's a group that's brought together by the FAA to really come up with a set of recommendations from which they can engage in rulemaking. And in this case, it was beyond visual line of sight. And there's a charter that's set up, and it outlines sort of the scope of what we can discuss. We can't go beyond the scope. And in terms of this ARC, it was to provide recommendations to the FAA for performance-based regulatory requirements to normalize safe, scalable, economically viable, and environmentally advantageous UAS BVLOS operations that are not under positive air traffic control. The ARC will take a holistic approach. Yes, it's full of sort of FAAEs. So in essence, what it does is we just come up with a set of recommendations for BVLOS so that the FAA can go out and do rulemaking.
Yeah.
So
and so this
that's
is
what it is in a nutshell.
Yeah, and this is what this document is, which is 250 pages of heavy reading. I read through a lot of documents with the FAA. This is the hardest time that I have reading this because it's dense. There's just a lot to digest. I'm not even done with it. So in a week or so, I think I'll be done when I've stopped falling asleep reading it in the evening. But tell us how many people were on the ARC and maybe the type of people that are on the ARC.
Sure. So there were 87 organizations on the ARC, and there were 5 academia standards bodies representatives. There were 5 infrastructure security, for example, that includes airport executives, American Petroleum Institute, petrochemical, etc. There is privacy interests involved. There's 3 of them: ACLU, EFF, EPIC. 12 state, local, tribal interests, including environmental and equity groups. And there were 17 technology network infrastructure interests. And if you were looking for DSPA and you couldn't find it, we are number 4 on the technology network infrastructure interest, which is interesting, but there we are. And then, of course, there were representatives from the traditional aviation associations. Those are your ALPA, AOPA, which are like Airline Pilots Association, Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, Women in Aviation, et cetera. And there were 10 of those. UAS associations, AUSI, which is Association of Unmanned Vehicle Systems International, Commercial Drone Alliance, Consumer Technology Association, 6 of those. UAS manufacturers, 6 representatives, and UAS operators, 21 of those. And those include organizations and companies like Ag Eagle, Amazon Prime Air, Zipline, State Farm, a lot of commercial interests as well.
Yep. Very varied group of people. Some that have an aviation background, some that have an aviation interest, and some of them not at all, but they represent a different industry.
Correct.
I know Vic has answering a lot of questions online about people that are confused about what this actually is. Is this final regulation? Is this proposed regulation? What is this document exactly, and how should people take the information in here?
Vic, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'll take that one. No, this is not. And we've seen, yay, I can fly BVLOS now. It's like, what?
Yep.
Time out. No. You can't. I mean, you can, but you're going to get in trouble. Nothing is physically stopping you, but it still will be illegal. So there's still a lot of steps still to go, which I know we'll talk about in a little bit. But no, it's just a suggested set of regulations thought out by a very well organized group of people to give to the FAA. The FAA is going to look at it and go, sure, or no. I'm thinking yes. I'm thinking they're really, because they understand. The FAA understands that BVLOS ops are the last major hurdle for anybody really to scale systems up. That's got to happen, and I think there's an awful lot of really good stuff in this report that I'm looking forward to learning about, because I haven't read it all either.
Who could?
Vic, you should have read that. But and I can't emphasize enough that you can't fly BVLOS without a waiver or exemption at this point, unless you have a COA.
Right.
So just to be aware of that. And overall, one thing you should also know when you read this, this is industry representation. So we are reaching for a lot of this stuff, and it's a reach. So we might get dialed back in terms of what comes out from the FAA in rulemaking, because they might get said, you're asking for too much. We need to dial it back. But unless we reach for it, they're going to come back from what we recommended. So that's why there's a reach in a lot of this.
And we can maybe do a parallel with what happened with remote ID. There was an ARC, they made recommendations, submitted to the FAA. The FAA digested the recommendations, and then they made an NPRM, Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, and they ignored a lot of what the ARC had mentioned in there. And they actually talk about it when they talk about the NPRM. They say, well, the ARC recommended this, and we're not going to do it because, and then they give a reason. So we can expect something similar to this. Obviously, you being on the ARC, you probably hope that a lot of this goes through, but it's going to be really up to the FAA what they want to do with it. So before we move into the next section, which is essentially talking about the recommendations themselves, how many people voted on this, and how many were for it, against it, and didn't care about it, and all that stuff? Do you have those numbers?
Yeah, total of 86, 64 concurs, 10 non-concurs, and 12 no ballots or abstentions. So
Okay.
that's how many organizations voted.
Yeah, and there is an interesting document online available. If you're not satisfied with those 250 pages here, there's another 250 pages of the people that have voted and explain why they voted for or against. And actually, I did go through that, and there's a very insightful information in there. Even those that are against, I think they have a good point. So, all right, let's go into recommendations. And recommendations are divided into subcategories if you want. The first one is risk, air and ground risk, and it's called AG and ground. So AG 2.1 is the first one in here, and I'm gonna read it, and then Kenji or Vic, you guys can talk about what you think about it. 2.1 was acceptable level of risk should be consistent with accepted fatality rates of general aviation. What do you have to say about that?
So, Greg, just to give a little background, what the acceptable level of risk is in aviation, there's an accepted level of fatalities, and if you think about it, it's there in general aviation. There's fatalities on an infrequent basis. I mean, it's more than we want, but it's never going to be an absolute zero. So there's an accepted societal level of risk that we as a society are going to accept that there's going to be fatalities. With drones themselves, we are so new that there's not a lot of data where we can actually come up with what that acceptable level is. So we needed to look at sort of comparators out there. And there's general aviation. We even looked at the fatalities in autos as well. But we thought that sort of general aviation would be a good sort of benchmark to look at. And there's actually two types of risk too. There's air risk and there's ground risk as well. And that's what's in there as third party risk. So the chance of fatality of somebody on the ground who's uninvolved. And there's been some work looked into it. And just to back up a second, one of the things that I made sure that we brought into it was the idea that there have been zero fatalities tied to UAs. Well, there are a couple to a person. There was a helicopter that took off somebody's head in New York, or a scalp. But just to give you an example, DJI actually came out with a study that showed in 2019, they estimated there was around 10.3 million flight hours with zero fatalities. In comparison, general aviation, they experience a fatal accident of 1.029 fatal accidents per 100,000 flight hours. We know that there's no risk in a UA in terms of if a UA crashes, nobody on the UA is going to be dying because there's nobody on board. But there is that risk to the ground, and there is the risk to sort of aviation in general. So that's where we came out with the recommendations that we did in terms of suggested to the FAA that they look at both the air risk and ground risk. There's going to be a specific rate in terms of fatalities per number of flight hours. And there's actually a recommendation from the AC, which is the Advanced Aviation Advisory Committee, which used to be the DAC, which was the Drone Advisory Committee. And we were looking at a sort of a 10 to the negative seventh, or one death per every 1 million hours, or I think, or somewhere around there. And you'll probably see that in that ballpark, but it's going to be up to the FAA and the statisticians they involve to figure out what that final rate is going to be.
Yeah,
Sorry.
and the FAA
I geeked
decides
out.
that. Yeah, and
Yes.
they were also talking in the report about using mid-air collision fatalities, not necessarily people being in the airplane and killing themselves by hitting the ground. They're talking about just and general aviation aircraft impacting the ground and killing someone on the ground. So I think that's the level of basis that they were using for this.
Yeah.
So 2.2,
Yep.
AG 2.2, still talking about risk here. It says a rule should be predicated on the risk of operation based on the UA, the unmanned aircraft, capability, size, weight, performance, as opposed to the actual purpose of the operation. What was the reasoning behind there?
So one of the things that you want to be aware is that when we looked at the sort of problem set, is that if you look at it, it's characteristics of the operating environment. So one of the primary things is it flying over uninhabited areas? Is there a lot of sort of air traffic? Is it going to be flying in adverse conditions, etc.? So it's instead of saying um, there's characteristics of each operation that sort of go into the pot rather than the purpose of the operation. Like the purpose of the operation could be agriculture or long line infrastructure inspection. What you can do is break out each of those operations into specific characteristics, like long line operations. And what's meant by long line operations is, for example, inspecting railroads, inspecting power lines, etc. In most circumstances, those are going to be in unpopulated areas where the risk is known. So there's going to be certain requirements for operations that occur in those low risk environments. Whereas there are some power lines that occur in sort of higher density areas. And in those higher density areas, you're going to require certain mitigations as well. So those mitigations are either technical, and what's meant by technical is what's on board before you take off. And that could be, for example, type certification, which means it's an aircraft that goes through hundreds of thousands of hours of testing to show that it's reliable and durable. Or there's other mitigations such as parachutes or other types of things that take care of it. Whereas strategic, you think about where you're going to fly, so you don't fly over populated areas or large crowds. Which brings up an interesting point. If you look through the report itself, when they talk about sort of population densities, it takes a look at recommends taking a look at not just sort of sheer population density in terms of the like, for example, a city, but also recommends that they take into consideration things like time of day. Because if you think about it, there's not many people out during the workday, but like in the middle of winter. But say, for example, to take that same area during the summer, there might be lots of people. So there's around the weekend, there might be lots of people as well. So sorry about that aside, but just wanted to mention that.
I think it's an interesting approach because a lot of people in our comments, when we post videos, people say, well, what is the difference? What is the reasoning behind looking at an operation from a recreational perspective or from a non-recreational perspective? Why don't we look at it from the risk of the actual operation, which is what some other countries have decided to do. And I think this is more in line with this, which to me makes a lot more sense. The same activity under Part 107 or under recreational flying could have the same level of risk, but follow different regulation, which in my head doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. If you're both flying over like crowded streets, it's the same amount of risk if you're using the same platform. I mean, that doesn't change. I mean, the only thing that could change is if your training level. But
okay,
that's about it.
So let's move to AG 2.3.
I got a real quick question while we're on this. Somebody popped up, Aerial Northwest, and I'm sorry, I don't know who that is. I should know who that is. I feel really bad about that. When considering UA fatality percentages, was indirect cause factored? That's an interesting question. Not sure exactly what he means by indirect cause, but weather? I don't know. Do you know, Kenji, if that was if an indirect cause was in there in the equation?
No, it was just based on sort of fatalities.
Yep.
So we didn't look at that, not as far as I remember. And I led the phase 1 safety subgroup as well.
Gotcha.
So we didn't look at causation.
Okay.
Yeah, I think causation might be irrelevant, actually. It's all about safety mitigation, risk mitigation. So I think causation doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even if you take a look at weather, for example, and Greg, you train your pilots to sort of, that's part of planning. I mean, you look at what the weather report's going to be. You look at the chances of, say, for example, shear winds, etc. So that's part of planning, and that's part of the risk equation. So
yep, I agree.
Right.
Okay,
Yep.
AG 2.3, no need for a waiver anymore to file BV loss. So the idea of removing the process of going through a waiver as long as you meet those requirements in this new proposed regulation.
And again, that what that came down to is to really the characteristics of the operation, and it's sort of creating standard scenarios or standard sets of characteristics. And if you employ the risk appropriate mitigations for each of those scenarios, then you don't need a waiver, because I think that we wanted to reserve exemptions and waivers for those operations that went beyond those standard scenarios, or and that's a lot of what happens in Europe with what's called Jara Sora. In, I forget what the exact sort of acronym stands for, but it's a sort of a paradigm by which risk is sort of analyzed that they have in Europe. But there's standard scenarios which have a certain set of characteristics, and if you fly by those, you don't need it. And we just wanted to ensure that it was easy as possible to comply, because nobody likes to go through the waiver process. The FAA does not like to go through waivers and exemptions because that takes time and effort. And for my own exemption, it took 2 years. So,
They don't have
and
the
at the
bandwidth.
speed at which, yeah, and it's the speed at which industry evolves. 2 years is just way too long. So there was a
Yep.
look at streamlining it as much as possible.
Yep. And kind of along with this is allowing operation over people, including sustained flight, which I think is kind of goes in hand with what we just talked about.
Yeah, and then again, that's a lot of that has to do with the risk mitigation, and whether that is type certification, DNR, durability and reliability testing. It's all part of the mix to allow sort of those sustained operations over people, which reduces the likelihood of failure. And if there is a failure, that it reduces the potential impact upon human beings.
Makes sense. The next thing is flight rules. We're moving to B, flight rule recommendations, and I think to me that's where the meat and potatoes is. When I read the report initially, I was like, "Whoa, that's some major changes here," including what people I think are going to be excited about, which is shielded operations. So we'll get to shielded operation in a second, but FR 2.1 essentially talks about amending 91.113. So before we go into 91.113 and talk more, 91.113 is right-of-way rule for manned aircraft operation. Anything in Part 91 is operating rules for manned aircraft. So this report talks about amending 91.113 for a bunch of different things, but the first one is to use sensing technology in order to meet the requirement of see and avoid and see and detect. Is that right, Kenji?
Yep, and that's correct. And I got to give kudos to John Damish from Iris Automation, who was behind a lot of that, and he was instrumental in recommending that we change that see and avoid to detect and avoid, because there's a lot of ways to be able to sort of satisfy the avoidance, detect and avoid, and that's one of them, is to be able to use technology instead of just seeing it with your Mark 1 eyeball, as our friends at HII like to say, to include other technologies, because there's different ways of doing things, and we need to evolve the regulations to allow for that.
Makes sense. So before we go and talk about shielded, non-shielded, and all that fun stuff, let's define a few terms. And let's define shielded operations. We've heard that term for quite a while now. How is it defined in this document, and how is it recommending that the FAA defines it?
So shielded ops, Vic, you've been quiet. Do you want to answer this, or do you want me to?
I know.
Answer?
I'm watching. You guys are the ones that are the experts here. I'm just watching the chat, and there's a couple questions.
I didn't.
No, that's fine.
I didn't want you
that's
to
fine.
feel left out. Okay,
nope. Go for it. I'm not left out.
So, Originally, we had started with obstacles, which could be human made or it could be natural, and then there was a movement toward human made, and then it went back to sort of obstacles, which obstacles include man-made structures, buildings, farmhouses, power lines, and then obstacles also includes sort of natural features too, like trees, cliff sides, etc. So that's the definition of sort of an obstacle, or what we considered an obstacle. Um, and shielded means is you're operating within a certain number of feet of that obstacle, and 100 feet is a lot. And to be honest, I think it's too much. I think this is one of those areas where it was a reach. Uh, and personally, I would have been very happy with within 50 feet of an obstacle, because if there's a traditional aircraft within 50 feet of a building or a tree, that's getting kind of sketchy. And I certainly wouldn't recommend it for any pilot to be doing that. I know some like the hot dog, but I think it's a dangerous thing. But I think that's sort of the perfect operation for a UA, and it's one of those where if somebody's flying within that close, they need to sort of avoid any UA that's flying that close to an obstacle, unless, of course, as proposed, they have ADSB or tabs. So
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a second. So non-shielded ops would be basically everything else below 400 feet. Yeah, 400 feet would
yep.
be a non-shielded ops. Okay, cool. So let's
And
go
then,
over the first recommendation. Is there a question?
oh,
No?
yeah, you want to. There's also one-to-many operations, just to define that. One-to-many is one responsible person or RPIC to multiple UA. So that's all that means.
Yeah, 1 to X number of UAS that are going to be controlled, and we'll talk about that when we talk about regulation.
Actually,
So,
I'm gonna jump
Mhm.
in real quick because I'm gonna disagree with Kenji about the 100 foot. I think 100 foot's perfect, and I'm looking at. I know you got extended versus local, which we'll get into, but I think that 100 foot is a really nice, safe bubble for operations, for US operations, whether it's quads or fixed or VTOLs or ETOLs or whatever. I think that 100 foot is perfect. You know, traditional aviation shouldn't be anywhere near that. I think it's going to give us plenty of separation. Now, you've got helicopters landing, blah, 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 stuff like that. That's the exception. But I like the 100 foot number a lot.
yeah. And
Oh, don't get me wrong, Vic. I love that number. I'm like,
you're being
yeah,
realistic.
You think
but
we've
but the
asked for too
question
much,
is,
though?
yeah, yeah.
So
I mean,
I,
the traditional aviation folks have some very strong arguments, especially the HAI folks, who conduct a lot of operations very close to say, for example, power lines and power line inspections and such. But at the same time, I see the other side too as well. When they're conducting power line inspections, they are not
Mhm.
going very fast. They're going very slow. So, and remember, this does not sort of remove the duty to avoid if you see or sense, right?
yep,
If you see it, you avoid it. That's just like
Right.
common sense.
that
So
should be number 1.
just remember
Yeah.
that.
And we
Mhm.
will give a
Mhm.
chance, actually. We'll do a much more in-depth video, not live like this, with a bunch of key players that were actually on the arc, that were for and against some pieces of this regulation. So I'm putting that together right now. But as you can imagine, this is a much bigger project. So we wanted to get this, the short version. The other one is probably going to be a 2-hour discussion. So let's talk about F
Oh,
2.2.
it'll be more than a discussion.
Well, and it's I,
It'll be a debate. I can guarantee you that.
and that's good because I'm going to interview each person individually, actually. So I want to get their point of view. And
Oh,
I'm a
really?
neutral person. I'm a neutral point. I don't want this to be a debate between the two. I just want them to kind of explain why they are against it. And I think that's what people want to hear or need to hear. F
Mhm.
2.2, unmanned aircraft in non-shielded low altitude areas below 400 feet should yield to crewed aircraft with ADS-B. So you have an aircraft with ADS-B, you're not within 100 feet of an object, then you as the unmanned aircraft pilot should yield the right of way to anybody else that has ADS-B. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that's obvious. I mean, if a lot of drones on the market are coming with ADS-B in, and ADS-B in is pretty cheap. And if they're electronically conspicuous, guess what? You need to yield to them. That makes sense. I think it's a great idea. DJI has AirSense, which is absolutely phenomenal in terms of I use it with my my DJI FPV, which I affectionately call my flying potato. But I certainly appreciate that.
AirSense is nice. It's a little annoying. It needs to be keyed a lot better. I flying out at DIA today, and I just had to turn it off on the Mavic 3 because it just kept blowing up. So it's like, okay, there's got to be some different parameters we can put in there. But yeah, I like it, and I think it's definitely having that. We have to detect and avoid. It's that simple in situations like that. I think I love the suggestion.
And then the next thing we had was 2.3. And I messed up my notes here and I deleted part of it. Essentially, what it says is that unmanned aircraft that are in non-shielded low-altitude areas below 400 feet will have right-of-way over crewed aircraft that are not equipped with ADS-B, and that's kind of a biggie. Can you talk about that?
That is a very, very controversial subject, and I understand why, because this is a significant departure from what has traditionally sort of been understood as right-of-way regulations in terms of the more maneuverable has to sort of yield to the less maneuverable. And this was up to significant debate, and you will see in the statement of non-concurrence by a lot of the traditional aircraft folks that this is a big problem. So, yeah, and I'll just leave it at that. This will be a great discussion to have. I don't know if this will survive into rulemaking. There will be congressional pressure put on this. So because a lot of these traditional aviation interests have a lot of say and a lot of political power. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah.
And
when I read that one, I was kind of shocked it actually made it to the report. But it's like, cool. If it happens, it happens. But that might be one of the ones that goes away. But
yeah, I'm torn. I'm torn as both a manned and unmanned aircraft pilot. I'm torn on this. I see an issue on both sides for sure. So it's going to be difficult, I think, for the manned aircraft side to swallow that. Okay, F2.4.
I'm a little. Just to go back to that, I'm a little sort of hesitant on that as well, because we don't want segregated airspace, and this almost gets to that where non-equipped folks would not go into below that. And I think we want to integrate into the airspace, and that sort of goes against the grain. But at the same time, I see the positive benefits as well. So,
but at the same time, ADS-B is required to enter a certain airspace, Class B, Class C. You gotta have the equipment if you want to play. So, yeah, it's going to be an interesting discussion. Okay, FR 2.4. Unmanned aircraft have the right of way for shielded operations, period. So if you're in shielded ops, 100 feet within anything else, like you said earlier, it kind of makes sense, right, that we want shielded operation and have right of way.
Mm-hmm. For me, it makes sense, because that's for a lot of what we call that'll be very useful for local BV loss as well. So that's like a lot of infrastructure inspection, like you're inspecting like an industrial area or anything like that where it's out of sight for a little while. But yeah, this one's going to be super useful for inspection. I mean, that's where I see this being a big bonus to folks.
Do you see this as being a big for FPV as well?
Yeah,
I would.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think that might be the solution for what FPV pilots have been looking for.
Yep.
Yep. And I can see
Well,
that here
that's
in
not
Colorado. Go ahead.
that's not the complete picture that we need to. That's just an element in
Right.
terms of, remember, this is sort of right of way. So that's only part of the equation. There's other, and we'll address the rest of the equation later on in the report.
Yeah, in a pilot qualification, right?
I think one of the fun parts of that aspect of it is here in Colorado, Eastern Plains, we have a lot of fields of corn and soybeans and wheat and smaller fields of other things. But you've got some large properties that someone's going to want to go fly in multispectral, and they're going to be able to do it BB loss, but maybe in the field next door, you got an ag pilot spraying. So there's going to be some interesting coordination when it comes to that kind of stuff.
Yep. Yeah, because ag pilots don't have ADSB.
They don't. Some don't even have radios.
Yeah. Yep.
I've seen some of them fly. I'm not sure some of them have brains.
Yeah,
I'm
those
sorry,
are the
that's not.
aircraft.
They're awesome people. They're awesome. I mean, they're crazy though.
They are crazy. They're really good pilots, very high skills.
They're awesome pilots.
All right, F4 2.5, increase the unmanned aircraft awareness among crew aircraft pilots. Essentially, having a campaign to let aircraft pilot know that there's actually unmanned aircraft flying. And Vic and I, we've been on some meetings with the FAA to talk about this, and I welcome this. I think this is a great idea.
Yeah, and especially when it comes to sort of obstacles and more heavier areas where they can expect it. It's like training. There's a rail line here. There's sort of power lines here. You can expect drone activity around those, so just be aware of that. Make sure to check your NOTAMs for potential operations. So there's a big educational component to increasing safety, especially with around BV loss and sort of traditional aviation, and making sure that people are aware that they might be around, because the more information that's out there, the better.
Yep. And we're actually working on a video right now to edit it for the FAA that is geared towards helicopter pilots, to let them know that there's going to be unmanned aircraft in the area and that they need to be paying attention, and that those unmanned aircraft pilots may not have the knowledge of a helicopter in the area, or they may not even know the rules, which doesn't look good on us, but that's kind of the reality, unfortunately. So, all right. F2.8, 2.9, these, we combine them together. It says that the FAA should amend 107.31 and 107.33 to allow EV loss. So, Kenji, you've got a lot to unfold here. Let's talk about EV loss first. What's EV loss?
So hold on one second, Greg. That there's one piece that I want to get to. I forgot to mention this before the show. 2.7. So minimum safe altitudes. There's a recommendation to change it. So UA are specifically exempted from the minimum safe altitudes, and that's has some policy implications, which are very good. So that's adding UA to 91.119, which will allow UA to operate less than the minimums. And if for those folks out there who actually read the report, there's a slight clarification that needs to be made in subsection 3, which says a UA may be operated less than the minimums prescribed in B or C of the section, provided those operations are done in accordance with 14 CFR 108. That should include 107. That's likely a mistake, and 107 ops were left out of there, and also other UA as well. So just as a heads up on that. But back to 2.8. This was my baby. This is, well, 2.7 was mine, but also 2.8. And the genesis of this was Brendan Schulman, formerly with DJI, now with Boston Dynamics. And he said, hey, dude, you should really talk about the line of sight and change it a little bit. So I was like, okay. And I went with it and had this extended visual line of sight. And what that means is, guess what? You don't have to see your drone anymore your entire flight. You just need to have airspace awareness. So for mapping missions, this will be absolutely invaluable, especially
Mhm.
if you're using a smaller drone like a Mavic Mini or a Mavic M2 Pro, because that goes out of sight really quickly. And you can fly out to 3 statute miles, if this makes it through the FAA and you have and it comes out in the final rule, that you can fly all the way out there as long as you can see around where you know your drone is. It's going to be extremely helpful. There are some requirements, uh, which includes, you have to receive training on and be permitted to operate an aviation radio, and you'll need to be able to monitor. You'll need to monitor aviation frequencies for nearby traffic. Uh, so that's 10731. 10733 is just simply allowing the visual observer to have that airspace awareness as well. And the hidden gem in here as well is for FPV. So if you think about it, uh, you can have airspace awareness because they're so maneuverable using sort of your FPV camera. So you can gain airspace awareness using that as well. So just food for thought. This is probably the most critical piece for 107 ops. And there's some there was some pieces about training, but we can get into that later as well. So
Yeah, I think the training is coming up in D. And I find this very interesting. A new concept: EV loss versus BV loss, and short distance. You know, we see this in public safety. There's already a waiver that you can get in order to do some sort of short BV loss, which to me makes sense. Completely different operation, completely different world when you're doing this versus doing 50 or 60 miles away. BV loss, that's a completely different world. So this will be interesting as well. Interesting discussion.
I would love to see this one
yeah, and
happen because it's, situations like me, if I'm out doing video or I'm out doing stills, I'm kind of limited to that 1,000, 1,200 foot distance because, and that's assuming I got a VO that has good eyesight. It's too limiting for me to do what I need to do the vast majority of the time, and it's as safe as you can possibly make it. You have absolute 100%, ability to see what's around you, back behind you, to your right, to your left. You've got a VO working with you. The EV loss needs to go. It needs to happen. I mean, it needs to happen fast.
Yep.
So that's my 2 cents.
here's
Sorry.
the other thing. Yeah, here's one other thing too. We had the backing of both AOPA and HAI on this. So the traditional
Awesome.
aviation folks were on board with this. So the likelihood of this going through, I think, is very high.
Wow. That's actually surprising that they would back this up, but that's cool.
No, they were totally cool with it. I was like, sweet. Yeah.
Okay, the next portion subcategory has to do with aircraft and systems recommendation. Now, there's a lot more in here than
We didn't
what I
talk about
selected.
2.9,
2.9?
the visual observer assist, because there's a question in the chat
Yep,
right
I
now
did.
that's a perfect segue into that.
All right, let's do it.
Oh, you did? Did you?
No.
I'm sorry, I guess I didn't hear it. But the question is, why not just daisy chain VOs? Is that allowed if 107, if 2.9 is allowed, 10733 is it going to have, or is it going to include the ability to daisy chain VOs on radios?
I hadn't thought about that. But
I did. I thought
I did.
I thought it would be covered.
And somebody else asked, it's like, oh yeah.
I thought it would be covered
the way it's
it.
written. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
That
it's
would be
bonus
awesome.
for
This is
me.
something a lot of people get confused and they think they can do now.
Oh boy, do we get the questions on that? Yeah, big
Oh,
time,
no.
big time. And
All
FAA
right.
people are confused about that too. So sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, it's all good. let's talk about aircraft and systems recommendation. This is a bit more technical, and I didn't think this was something that's going to be as much of an interest for our viewers. So I pick only one in here, and it's 2.1, the first one. It says the rule should be applicable to uncrewed aircraft up to 800,000 foot-pound of kinetic energy. What does that mean?
Yeah. So that was out of my group. So I just looked at it and said, okay, the 800,000 foot-pounds is like 55 pounds. And I mean, that's one of those which I wasn't going to argue against in terms of qualifying like UA to fly BV loss up to 55 pounds. I was like, okay, it's just a process. So that's about it.
So
It's a process.
yeah,
Go ahead.
they use kinetic energy in this case. From what I read, 800,000 pounds of foot-pounds of kinetic energy. That's roughly a light sport aircraft. Is that right?
Yep.
So that's pretty big. If for people that think this is only for small aircraft, this is designed for large aircraft that are going to carry, a whole bunch of different packages and everything. This is not just for your little Mavic and even Inspire. This goes a lot bigger.
And I think the reason that the 800,000 pounds was chosen, even though it's a large number, is, say, for example, you are doing BV loss ops in the middle of nowhere where there's nothing except trees or something like that, then the risk profile is going to be pretty low, and that's why that the threshold was chosen, because to allow that sort of operations in those low risk areas. And of course, as again, going back to the characteristics of the operation, the mitigations, of course, are going to be appropriate for the operational environments and the characteristics of the operation.
Awesome. I know we get a lot of people watching. I do want to give a quick shout out to the people out there. We get Eddie, Maddie, we get My New Drone Business. I love that name. Get Sam, Dirk. Those people are here quite a bit on our channel, so I want to give them a little shout out. All right, let's move to D. Unless you guys can think of another one in aircraft and systems that was kind of outstanding, but it was pretty technical when I read it. Not just,
It's pretty technical. Yeah.
Okay.
I didn't read that section.
I haven't read fully yet. I didn't even get that far. Okay. The D has to do with operator qualifications. And this is an interest for me, obviously, as a training provider. But I think this would be of interest for viewers as well, because there is a bit of an extension to Part 107. So OQ, Operator Qualification 2.1, the FAA should create a new 14 CFR part, in this case, Part 108 is recommended, that governs UAS, BV loss, pilots, and operators certification requirements. What do you have to say about that?
So it was fairly interesting in terms of the qualification requirements, because originally they were going to throw EV loss in there, and there was no carve out, and that was sort of the big bugaboo where I got into it with the large organization, but I ended up winning the argument. But it was nice. 108 is in sort of a new certificate which will be based on sort of higher levels of automation. There's one particular piece of it I think that needs to be clarified, which is an automation level 2, which is it's autonomous, but there's a human in the loop, which you can hit return to home and all that stuff. And those operations, for example, are the ag operations, or the mapping operations, where you do your flight plan, you just hit go, goes up. You can hit return to home or something like that if something goes wrong. The way it's written in the rule right now, you need to get a 108, but I think because we're already doing those operations anyways, that it should fall under 107 for EV loss, for extended visual line of sight.
Yep.
And it's not appropriate for BV loss. But Yeah, generally the 108 is fine. There's certain operations that'll fall under it, sort of one-to-many. And the reason that they do one-to-many BV loss ops, it's if you think about it for delivery drones, if there's one person overseeing like five different drones that are off doing their own deliveries, that sort of covers that scenario where that person is up just watching all five of them, and if something goes wrong, they can sort of send it back. So that's what we're talking about, part 108.
Yep. And that's OQ 2.2. They talk about training and qualification based on levels of automation, which is what you mentioned. So we have, they
Yep.
call AFR, and I don't remember what AFR stands for, but AFR level 1, 2, 3, and 4. Level 1 would be just a manual system, so you're just flying the drone by
Yep.
hand. And then increased automation for level 2, so that's what you're talking about, where you would have a semi-automation helping you a little bit. Level 3 would be extensive automation. A lot you add. Basically, the pilot is kind of just looking,
Yep.
seeing what's going on. And then level 4 would be close to full automation or just fully automated. So there would be different requirements depending on how you wanted to operate. 2.3, that was an interesting one as well. Enable limited BV loss. So for Part 107 remote pilots, and then what would be the conditions for this in this case in 2.3?
So the what limited BV loss is pretty much EV loss. So they're pretty much equivalent. Or the idea is flying sort of quote beyond visual line of sight where you don't see the UA. And if you look at it in the rationale, examples include such operations extending visual observers or modifying the visual observer requirements, aka EV loss, or shielded operations, where the drone goes behind your infrastructure and such. And the idea is you shouldn't need that extensive training that you'd be getting under 108. And there's like operations over people and operations at night. You know how they were just added to 107. The idea is to add that to the 107 training or the 107 knowledge test.
Yep.
So you understand what's required for it. So instead of a brand new certificate or anything like that, you just get this training if you already have your 107 or go on your knowledge test. You're going to study for that. There's going to be questions. So
Yep.
that's the rationale behind 2.3.
Yeah, and I think
Isn't that sort of what Jay Merkel was talking about in Drones After Dark during Drone Safety Awareness Week last year?
I think so.
Didn't he
That-
challenge us to this?
and you've been trying and you can't, right?
I'm trying. Kenji and I are both trying.
I'm waiting for you guys to get it and I'll try, but it's a lot of energy.
Yeah.
So
mine's in process, by the way. So we'll see.
Oh, really?
That's good.
Mine's still just submitted. My third one is still just submitted.
So EV loss under Part 107, BV loss, WAFAR would be under Part 108. So the majority of people that want to fly VLOS, they want to do it EV loss. They want to do it locally, not that far, and that should fall under Part 107. So I can see the logic there. It kind of makes sense to me. And then expanding the knowledge test under Part 107 to include some VLOS information so that you can fly EV loss. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's exactly what it is.
Yep.
And if you look at the approach, it's we describe some sort of areas to cover.
All right, we'll start updating our Part 107 course.
Not yet. No,
No,
remember,
not yet.
these are just proposed. Yes.
No, I know. 2.5, 2.6, establish new BV loss rating. So this is a rating for remote pilots and included in the Part 107 exam. So that's what we just talked about, I think. And
You
that
want
would
to
be an
wait.
added rating in the back of your card, just like a man aircraft pilot can get an instrument rating. This would be an additional rating that says, well, you can fly now, BV loss. It's something else that you can add to your certificate.
Yep.
2.9, ability for current Part 107 to add the BV loss rating online. Just like you can renew your Part 107 online now or your currency, you would be able to get the BV loss if you already have the Part 107. Was there anything to add there?
No, not really. That's the idea behind the daylight waiver slash sort of ops over people, all that additional training. And I think they might have messed up here. It should be EV loss, but yeah, I think we get what they mean. So
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the next one is interesting. It's going to get a lot of people confused because everybody wants to call us remote pilot operators or remote operators. But now the FAA is introducing this term of operator, which means something different. So, a remote air carrier and a remote commercial operating certification. Can you talk about these two and what they mean and the difference between the two?
I really didn't work on this part, so that's
Okay, well, I'll explain it. So the
No.
remote air carrier is like an air carrier right now, a Part 125, 121. Your airline, for example, is an air carrier. And the FAA wants to create something like this, but as a remote air carrier. So if you decide to start transporting people for compensation or higher, then you would fall under an air carrier, in this case, a remote air carrier. I know there was the man aircraft side of things were opposed to this. They wanted to keep everything under Part 135 and the way that we have it right now so that it works. But you guys, I say you guys, the ARC recommended that we create something different, separate, in order to do this. So the opposition basically says, hey, we have something in place, continue using it. We don't need to do this. So that's what this would look like. And then the commercial operating certificate is the same thing that we have in the man aircraft world, where we have a commercial operator, which is someone who engages in flying aircraft. So United, American, they're commercial operators, if you want to look at it this way. All right. Next thing, operational control for one too many UAS BV loss flights. So we kind of talked about one too many. Is there anything else that you want to add?
No, it's pretty much if you think about it, it's just a central control station or like a hub, or where say, for example, you have an office building where all the controls are happening and they're just monitoring like tons of drones all over the place. This is what it is. It's just to sort of permit that one person controlling or actually monitoring a lot of drones, whether they be delivery or inspection.
I talked to.
I see this as the final mile, or the last mile delivery type stuff. I see that's where this is really going to come in big, where they can go out and park their UPS or Amazon or whatever. Top lifts off, and they got one operator in there pushing buttons, and the drones go out and do those final mile deliveries. I think that's going to be huge.
Yeah, I had a meeting recently.
You can do that, or inspection too.
Yeah, I had a meeting with one of these operators that shall remain nameless, but they were talking about 1 to 50 or 1 to 100. One person controlling 50 to 100 aircraft up in the air. Yeah, I'm not sold. Let's talk about 216.
Well, you think about it. The light shows are an example of that.
Yeah, but it's very local. They're all in the same phase of flight.
Local.
They're all doing the same thing. When you have 50 aircraft that are flying in all phases of flight, even if it's very automated, if you have two of them that go down at the same time, you can only take care of one. So, well, but I'm sure they have.
I'm with you on this one, Greg. I'm with you on this one.
We'll grow to it. I'm sure we'll grow.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of automation too in terms of in safety mitigations that'll be employed as well. So
Yeah.
don't forget that it's not just like there's going to be multiple things going wrong, and it is there is a remote possibility about that, but
Remote.
they're trying to design them so
Yeah, the FA won't
things
allow
like
it,
that
we
won't
know,
happen.
until they're comfortable. And then 216 is the last one in this category. Then we only have two more after this, which is the pilot medical qualification for unmanned aircraft pilots that are going to fly BVLOS. And to me, it makes sense. You're going to be doing much more complex operation. You should be fit to do that. Anything else you want to add?
Yeah, but if you look at the language itself, it really sort of talks about there's no rudders to sort of use your feet for. So it's where appropriate. In terms of the medical qualification, it's super important that people with disabilities can also get involved, and they're trying to make it not a barrier. So it's a risk appropriate sort of analysis in terms of what medical certificate is even required.
And I don't remember, maybe you do, Kenji, if there was an actual like class, first class, second or third class like we
Mm-mm.
have right now.
Mm-mm.
No, I didn't see it. So
Yeah, that was
I know,
actually one of the questions that was sent to me beforehand by Robbie Betcher, who's a drone pro in Texas. He was, he's also a
Yeah.
manned aviator. It's like, well, is this going to be a class 1, class 2, class 3? It's like, well,
Yeah.
that's to be determined. But yeah, I didn't have any
Yeah.
insight. So apparently it's just sort of hanging out there, and we'll see.
Yeah, and if you look at page 45, it says tailor medical qualifications to remove barriers for UAS pilots and crew who are fully able to perform UAS operations. So that's
Yeah.
that's the key critical point that is sort of in there.
yeah, if you guys want to
Right.
look at more detail, it's in the 90s to 100. That's where they talk about all this stuff. I have it right here, but
Page
we-
129.
129. Okay.
Yep.
So we have
UAS
two
pilot
more.
medical full qualifications.
Full qualification, yeah. We have two more, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions. We're coming in on an hour now. And there was one section that I skipped, which had to do with environmental. Not I'm not into the environment, but I think these didn't apply nearly as much. They were a bit more complex and very specific. And the last one we had was general and procedural recommendation. One of them was to enhance the public understanding of the benefits of UAS BVLOS use. And I thought that was interesting. We've talked about this quite a bit. I know, Vic, we've talked about this in FA meetings. Anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that flies into, actually feeds in directly into the acceptable level of risk in terms of the benefits. If there's a very big benefit for BVLOS operations, then people are more likely to accept that risk. And for example, BVLOS sort of operations that deliver medical supplies, BVLOS that enable like tactical BVLOS for law enforcement operations, and they see the benefits that come out. And we all talk about like the coffee delivery and all that stuff, and it's like it's not decidedly very useful. But guess what? Wing ran some trials in Australia, and they were, when that person didn't get their coffee delivery, they got pissed off. So I mean, they really valued that benefit. You got me.
Well,
on
it
that,
is
but,
coffee, so that's understandable.
Yeah, it is coffee, but at the same time, the more we can show the societal benefit, the more people are tolerant of risk, and also, for example, noise, if they're getting what they
Mhm.
want. So
Yep.
there's some definite positives to sort of talking to people about how they're benefiting from it. So
Yeah, and I think one of the things that the privacy groups mentioned is that there wasn't really a whole lot of discussion regarding what this means for the privacy of people on the ground. And I have to agree with that. I think we have to be cognizant of how people feel about drones being on top of their backyard and all of this. As legal as it may be, it's still something that's going to slow us down, I think, in the long run, with acceptance.
Well, the FAA is on record as saying they don't want anything to do with privacy. So does that mean we're going to have another arm of the FAA come in and start taking over the privacy aspect of it? So
Local
it's going to be
regulation.
interesting to see how that plays out. Yeah, local regulation.
yeah.
And a lot of them
what's
already cover it.
interesting is that, yeah, the interesting thing is privacy is very important, And I agree
Mhm,
with
mhm.
you, but it has to be taken in context of how much privacy we give up already. I mean, you look at it, if you're on Facebook, guess what? It's like privacy. It's like, yeah, okay. And I think part of that is just showing the benefits as well. So,
Yep, I agree.
mhm.
And then the last one, not the least, I know you had something to do with this, was the network remote ID implementation and bringing the concept of network remote ID back on the table for BV loss, which I personally think that's where it belongs, not for those local flights, but for the BV loss flights. You want to expand on that?
Yeah, so it was interesting because this was sprung on us pretty late in the game in terms of the language about network remote ID, and it was a lot of originally it was saying national security agencies and the FAA must sort of look at network remote ID, and I was like, wait a second, you just touched that third rail that we spent years dealing with. And I was able to draft this language, specific language that's in the ARC report to say, hey, I get it. Network remote ID is going to be helpful, but it has to sort of add on to broadcast and allow those folks who want to use network remote ID utilize it, not force it onto anybody else. And the other piece too is that even if you use network remote ID, that you have to use broadcast remote ID as well. So that's the rationale behind it, just to make sure that we don't us as a lot of us as visual on a site operators don't have to uh, have a cell phone plan to broadcast or actually have network remote ID. So
Yep, I agree. I concur. Well, do we have any good questions in the comments, Vic, that we haven't
There have been a
answered?
few, but I'm going to posit one first. That this is something I wanted to talk about. Now, this is the implementation date. How long it's going to take is sort of up in the air at the moment. If it does the NPRM route, it's going to take a while. What is the possibility of having the FAA and or those like ourselves who are involved in the process, seeing if we can get that put into the 2023 FAA Reauthorization Act? That would sure skip an awful lot of steps. Think it's worth pursuing?
it's a possibility, but at the same time, I think there's it all doesn't have to come at once. So
Mhm.
there's the potential like EV loss and sort of that
That's where I was
localized
headed.
BV
Yeah.
loss that we're talking about.
Mhm.
It's low hanging fruit. And
Mhm.
one of the things that we can do is encourage the FAA to adopt those fairly rapidly because they wouldn't require a lot of change
Right. That's just changing the language
and
in the
analysis.
current. Yep. Yep.
Yeah, and it's the logical stepping stone to get to sort of true BV loss. So it makes sense in terms of that crawl, walk, run paradigm that the FAA likes to talk about.
So short. So this would mean an NPRM from the FAA to make a small change, and then using the Reauthorization Act to create the larger regulation. That's every 5 years, roughly, right? So it's either
I think it'd be the
2023.
other way around. I think it would be easier to push the smaller EV loss type stuff into the reauthorization process because, like Kenji said, what is it? Crawl, walk, run. We're crawling, maybe walking, and the running stuff is going to be based on how well the crawling stuff goes. And
But
so,
then
if
we're
we can get EV
5 years
loss into the
away after that. We're
no, then it
2028.
would be the NPR. It would be the NPRM process after that for the
For the
longer
big stuff.
distance type VLOS stuff. I
I,
don't know, just Vic's theory. You can take it for
I
what it's
think
worth.
that the in term if Congress does that, then the FAA is going to have to create regulations around it. I mean,
Mhm.
that's the way that
That's all right.
process works, which I think
Yeah.
would take just as long because they're going to have to go through an NPR
Ah,
and such. So I think if possible, get the NPRM for the EV loss out as soon as possible, and sort of do a secondary NPRM later with the more heavier lifts. Uh, that's what I think would be the route that would be taken. But it'll be interesting to see, because the FAA was involved during the ARC, so they had access to sort of the process, and they know what's going on, so they can hit the ground running on a lot of this stuff.
Awesome. Vic, any questions
Yeah.
that you see in there?
Yeah, here
Let's
comes
see.
one. Another good one from Ariel Northwest. How much environmental wildlife area pushback was incurred in the development of the BV loss process? Was any of that taken into account in the ARC?
There was. I mean, there was a robust discussion about environment, especially surrounding the idea of noise and sound, and potential impact on sort of underserved communities. So that was discussed extensively. And there are pieces in the report that you can take a look on about the sort of environmental discussion.
Yep, and we'll talk about
But
that.
I
when
think
we do
the idea
review.
is that there'll be a category exclusion for BV lost flights.
Yep.
Makes sense. And then Matt Bagwell has a good question. For those of you who don't know,
Sure.
he's also a UPS pilot, so he's all excited about that final mile drone stuff. What if, and which one? I have to reword this. Well, basically he's asking, okay, is it going to be a supplemental test? Is it going to be a rating, like what we talked about just a little bit? But what do you think the odds are of it being something like the 10729 is just go online and do that? Or is the 108 going to be an entirely separate
It's
test?
a rating. It's a rating in the.
It is. The 108 is going to be a rating,
Yeah.
probably.
Yeah.
Again, we're guessing, so
it's going to require a lot. I mean, there's going
Right.
to be
As it should.
fairly significant.
Yeah,
But it would
as
be
it should.
added.
As
It
it
would
should.
be added to your card. So you'd be a remote pilot certificate. You would have the small unmanned aircraft rating, which is what you have now, and then you would have a BV loss rating. Again, that's if the FAA decides to follow what's in here, but that's the way I understand how the proposal is.
Mm-hmm. A
Makes
BV
sense.
loss rating. Yeah.
Yeah.
And what I mentioned that earlier, I think I might have been confusing my remarks, but yeah, it's a BV loss rating.
Good.
What else do we have in there?
Let's see what else we got in there. Oh, Rick Ornberg. Sorry, he says, I'm late. Did I miss anything? It's like, yeah, pretty much everything. But it's being recorded, so it will go in definitely on your channel. We may push it out on ours as well. So yeah, you'll make sure we get that out. There's an off-topic question about the best guess when the Oregon Parks and Recreation drone stuff. We'll get into that later.
I saw that Ariel Northwest.
unless you have any
stay
insight.
tuned.
Unless you have any insight.
Yeah, we need to rally the troops. We got a couple more
and
weeks
we will.
before that closes. Yeah, so
Yeah,
you'll hear
we
more
will.
about it.
I sent another call.
But don't
this
want to go down
morning
too many
on
rabbit trails.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I sent a call in the Friday news update. So
awesome. And I think scrolling through here, we've answered pretty much all the questions. Some were asked a little early, and then we got to it. Recommendation, Randy says eye exams would be a good recommendation. I think absolutely eye exams would be a really good part of 108. I know if I don't have a VO with good eyesight, I'm hosed, even with my glasses.
Yeah. Hey,
I think we're good unless somebody else pops one in.
Yeah. So recovery drone asks 108 equals BV loss. Yes, that's true BV loss.
Yes.
That's
Sorry.
separate from local BV loss. Yeah.
Yep. So golly, I think we pretty much got everything that people have asked, and y'all went a lot deeper than I thought we would. So that's cool. And now I'm glad I don't have to read it.
it only took an hour.
I still am going to read
minutes.
it, obviously. But gosh, anything else we can think of? Anybody else have any more questions? Just pop them in.
When I went after Wing, it was funny. This is just a funny anecdote. Because I telegraphed to them saying, hey, with the training requirements, really, are you going to require a completely different rating or certificate for EV loss operations? And I said, it just doesn't make sense. And I told them leading up to the big meeting where everybody was there saying, hey, dude, you need to address this. Hey, dude, you need to address this. And then this big organization was making a presentation about all the pilot qualifications and stuff. And he accidentally clicked off his presentation, and we could see his chat box, and I had raised my hand, and one of the heads of policy at this major company, and I start talking, and he goes, "Oh, there's Kenji," and everybody in the ARC saw that. So they made a T-shirt about me that said, "Oh, there's Kenji."
There's Kenji.
And they sent me a picture of it. So I got that. It's not as cool as the Vic Moss T-shirt. Which do you have back
I still
there?
need one of those.
It's
I
right
still
there.
need one of those. Yellow Rose has a good question too, but it's not off topic at all because it was discussed. There's the Vic Ross T-shirt from Mr. Ken Domo himself, the original Dobo himself. I still need one of those.
I'm wearing it in 15 minutes when I go to the airport.
Yay. It says the 107 talks about using aviation radio to alert pilots of your activity near an airport. Yes, the FAA does, the FCC no. So there is, we talked a little bit about it, but is there going to be an FCC FAA confab about when we can use the radio as ground pilots, basically?
Yes.
I know we can get the certificate or the pilot, or the whatever it's called. So okay,
that's the idea.
Good.
That's the idea.
Yeah, that's the idea. That's the idea. Absolutely. And I've got my little, what is it, the Yasu 554 or whatever. I don't know how to say it. The 550, which is not, it's not going to broadcast very far. It receives very well, but it doesn't broadcast very far. So is there going to be, do you think, okay, these are the radios you can use if you've got your ground station license to announce as a drone pilot?
Probably not. I mean,
or do you think it's necessary?
I doubt
Probably not. Okay.
They won't go down to that. There's a good question. Will be the EV loss thing apply to recreational use with drones under 250 grams? I don't know. I mean, that's going to be up to the FAA.
That's a different set of rules.
So, yeah. And that's covered under sort of statutory anyways.
That's a US code as opposed to federal regulation. So yeah, that's probably going to be something different. All right.
So could that be though addressed in the CBOs?
It would have to be, yeah.
Cool.
You could match
be
it.
Interesting.
Yeah, that makes sense.
As long as the FAA approves
I mean,
it.
the risk. Yeah, like we discussed, the risk analysis is going to be the exact same thing, right? Whether it be 107 or hobby, right? Or recreational.
Right.
Same platform, just at a different use. So it's completely rational to me.
All right, gentlemen. I think we're going to wrap it up. I appreciate your time as always. Insightful discussion. If you have questions, you're not watching this live, please leave them in the comments. We'll answer them. If you want more information about the Drone Service Provider Alliance, it's dspalliance.org. Please sponsor them, give them some money because they spend a lot of time doing this, especially going to DC. Now you're probably going to have some meeting in person, so we need to help you go out there and represent all these people. So I know we do at Pilot Institute. We've been a sponsor since the beginning. I believe in what you guys do. So I appreciate you being on the show, and we'll be in touch for the next one.
Absolutely. Great.
Thanks
everybody.
Greg.
Fly safe.
Appreciate it.
See you guys later.